This is a story I've never whispered to anyone, not even in my wildest diary entries. It's raw, it's messy, and it's the kind of secret you lock away, hoping it'll never claw its way out. But here I am, about to lay it all bare. I was 18, young enough to believe in dangerous fantasies, but old enough to know better. I fell for someone forbidden, a man who should have been my shield, my guide, my family. Instead, he became my greatest temptation. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. My mom remarried when I was 16, and Thomas walked into our lives like a hero from a romantic novel. He had this magnetic charm, the kind that made you want to lean in when he spoke. His smile, it could melt the coldest winter night. He wasn't just my mom's new husband. He was the center of our little world. And, God help me, I admired him. Maybe too much. I caught myself watching him. How his eyes lingered, how his laugh echoed through the house. It wasn't right, but it felt thrilling. Life at home was far from perfect. My mom worked endless hours, always too busy or too tired to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. That left Thomas and me alone a lot. At first, it was harmless. We'd chat about books, movies, little things that made me feel seen. But then his compliments grew softer, his touch lingered longer, and his gaze held something I couldn't quite define. Warmth? Desire? I didn't know, but I craved it like air. Writing used to be my escape, my safe haven. But soon, Thomas became my escape too. He had this way of making me feel like the most fascinating person in the room, even when the room was empty. I told myself it was nothing, a crush, a silly, fleeting infatuation. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a spark, it was a fire, and I was standing far too close to the flames. Some nights, I'd lie awake, replaying our conversations, wondering if he felt it too. Was I imagining the way his hand brushed mine at dinner? The way his voice dropped an octave when he said my name? I hated myself for the thoughts creeping into my mind, but I couldn't stop. And then one evening, as we stood too close in the kitchen, I felt it, the tension between us crackling like electricity. A tension that whispered, "This is wrong." But doesn't it feel so right? It began with gestures so small they were almost forgettable. A smile that lingered just a second too long. A compliment that felt a little more personal than usual. Thomas always knew how to make me feel noticed, but suddenly, I felt like the attention came with a different weight. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, our hands brushed while reaching for the same plate. It was brief, innocent on the surface, but something about the way he looked at me in that moment stayed with me. I replayed it in my mind that night, questioning whether I imagined it. Maybe I wanted it to mean something because, for the first time, I felt like I wasn't invisible. He saw me. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to be seen by him. I'll never forget the night everything changed. My mom had left town for work, as she often did, and Thomas and I found ourselves alone in the house. It was late, and the silence between us felt comforting, yet charged. We sat on the couch watching some forgettable movie, but the air between us made it impossible to focus. As the night wore on, the space between us seemed to shrink. At one point, I laughed at something he said, and he turned to me with this look like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Then, without a word, he reached over, brushing a strand of hair from my face. My heart raced. I told myself to get up, to leave the room, but I stayed. And then he leaned in. That kiss changed everything. It wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was intentional, and for the first time, I felt completely alive and absolutely terrified at the same time. That was the moment the line between us disappeared, and I knew we could never go back to the way things were. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rush of emotions was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Thomas was no longer just my stepfather. He was my secret, my escape, and my greatest thrill. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every moment we managed to steal away from the world felt like a small rebellion. But with every moment of excitement came an overwhelming guilt. I started avoiding my mom. I couldn't look her in the eye without feeling like I was wearing a scarlet letter. At dinner, I'd sit quietly, terrified. She could sense the shift between Thomas and me. The guilt weighed heavily, but it wasn't enough to make me stop. The way Thomas made me feel, the way he seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had, kept pulling me back to him. He would whisper things to me when no one else was around. Compliments that felt too intimate for a stepfather. Promises that made me feel like we were in our own little world. I should have known better. I should have stopped. But at 18, I didn't care about consequences. I cared about the way his touch sent shivers down my spine, the way his voice sounded when he called me by my name, the way he made me feel like I was the only one who mattered. We became experts at keeping our secret. Every moment we spent alone was calculated, every touch hidden behind closed doors. We would sit in the kitchen late at night, our knees brushing under the table, speaking in hushed tones so no one would hear. He would find excuses to be near me, offering to drive me to school or picking up things for me from the store. Each stolen moment felt like a victory. I began to crave his attention like an addiction, and when he wasn't around, I'd replay our moments together in my head. But the more we indulged in our secret, the more I felt like I was losing control. Every time I walked past my mom, I felt a pang of shame. I hated myself for what we were doing, but I hated the thought of losing him even more. Thomas started becoming bolder, more confident in our secret. He would hold my hand in the car, brush his fingers against mine when no one was watching. I started to wonder if we'd get caught, but part of me liked the risk. It made everything feel even more thrilling, even though I knew it was wrong. But the closer we became, the harder it was to pretend. I started pulling away from my friends, skipping family dinners, and spending more time locked in my room. I told myself it was because I was tired or busy, but deep down, I knew it was because I couldn't face the reality of what we were doing. Thomas would tell me not to worry, that we'd figure everything out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before our secret world came crashing down. And when it did, I wasn't ready for how much it would destroy. Keeping what we had a secret wasn't just difficult, it was exhilarating. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, we'd whisper across the house like teenagers sneaking around, every word heavy with risk. There were times he'd press a finger to his lips as he passed me in the hallway, his eyes daring me to follow him. When no one was looking, his hand would linger on my back a little too long, his fingers tracing circles that made my skin burn. It was a game, one that felt more dangerous with every passing day. He'd kiss me in the pantry, pin me against the wall in the garage, his hands exploring places that made me forget the world outside. I craved the thrill of it, the way he made me feel like I was the only person who mattered. But that fantasy started to crack the moment I saw his phone. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, lighting up with a message that wasn't meant for me. "Can't wait to see you tonight." My heart sank. My hands shook as I picked it up, rereading the words that didn't belong to our story. It felt like the ground beneath me was disappearing, the life we'd built together slipping away. I confronted him that night. I stormed into the living room, the phone in my hand, my voice trembling with anger. "Who is she?" I demanded, shoving the screen in his face. He tried to brush it off, claiming it was nothing, just a coworker being friendly. But I wasn't stupid. I looked into his eyes, searching for the truth, but all I found was hesitation. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't the only one. I wasn't special. "You've been lying to me," I said, my voice cracking. I could feel the tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You made me believe," I couldn't even finish the sentence. He reached for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "Don't touch me," I hissed, my voice dripping with betrayal. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. In that moment, the man I thought I loved, the man I had risked everything for, became a stranger. My mom found out a week later, but not because of me. She found the letter I'd written to him, tucked away in the back of my drawer. It was stupid of me to keep it, but I couldn't let it go. It was my confession, my proof that what we had was real, or at least, that's what I'd told myself. I'll never forget the sound of her voice as she called me into the kitchen. She was holding the letter in her hand, her knuckles white with anger. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear her. "I trusted you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this? How could you betray me like this?" Her voice broke, and for the first time, I saw her not as my mother, but as a woman who had been shattered. "Mom, I started, but she cut me off." Don't you dare try to explain this to me." She crumpled the letter in her hands, throwing it onto the counter. "You've destroyed everything. Everything." Her words hit me like a slap. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But what could I say? The truth would only hurt her more, and the lies were already choking me. I stood there, silent, as she walked away, slamming the bedroom door behind her. That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of her sobs echoing through the house. I had broken her heart, ruined the family she had worked so hard to build. And for what? For a man who had lied to me, just as he had lied to her. The weight of it all was unbearable, but there was no escaping it. My secret was out, and there was no turning back. I've never felt smaller, never felt so completely and utterly exposed. My mom stood there, the letter crumpled in her fist, her eyes red and swollen from crying. This was the woman who had sacrificed everything for me, her career, her dreams, and now she was looking at me like I was someone she didn't even know. "How could you?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could I say? How do you justify something so unforgivable? "I trusted you, both of you," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You've ruined everything. Do you even understand what you've done?" The weight of her words crushed me, but it was the look in her eyes that hurt the most. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, disappointment, and a grief so profound it felt like the air in the room had been sucked out. I tried to explain, to tell her that it wasn't all as it seemed, but every word that came out felt hollow. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely audible. But sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and walked away, leaving me standing there in silence. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing Thomas. I was losing her too. When everything came crashing down, I thought Thomas would stand by me. I thought we'd face the fallout together. But I was wrong. So painfully wrong. When my mom confronted him, he denied everything at first. "She's confused," he said, his voice calm and measured. "She's just a kid with a crush." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the man who had held me, kissed me, whispered that I was the only one who truly understood him. And now he was throwing me under the bus to save himself. When he realized there was no way out, that the evidence was undeniable, his mask slipped. He turned to me, his eyes cold and unrecognizable. "What were you thinking?" he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined my life." His words hit me like a slap. He called me immature, said I'd misread everything, accused me of making things up to hurt him. The man I thought I loved, the man I thought loved me, became a stranger in an instant. I felt sick, my chest tightening as the realization hit me. He never cared. Not really. I was just a distraction, a game he played until it stopped being fun. I stood there, frozen, as he stormed out of the house. My mom was yelling, demanding answers, but all I could hear was the sound of the door slamming behind him. He left without looking back, and with him went every lie I had ever believed. The days that followed were a blur of pain and silence. My mom filed for divorce almost immediately. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, became cold and lifeless. Thomas packed his things and left without saying a word to me. I wanted to hate him, but all I felt was emptiness. The whispers started soon after. In a small town, nothing stays a secret for long. Neighbors looked at me differently, their eyes filled with judgment and pity. Friends stopped calling, stopped texting. I became the girl who had slept with her stepfather, the girl who destroyed her family. I tried to keep my head up, to pretend it didn't bother me, but the weight of it all was suffocating. Every time I walked into a room, I could feel the stares, hear the whispers. I was a pariah, branded with a scarlet letter I'd never be able to erase. At night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The moments we shared, the promises he made, the lies he told. I had lost everything, my mom, my friends, my reputation. And for what? A love that was never real to begin with. A few weeks after Thomas walked out of our lives, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. One day, scrolling through social media, I came across a photo that made my stomach churn. It was Thomas, smiling, arms wrapped around a younger woman. She wasn't much older than me. Curiosity turned into a desperate need for answers, and I couldn't help but dig deeper. That's when I discovered the truth. He'd been seeing her while he was with me. The messages, the nights he disappeared, the lies. It all made sense now. Every promise he'd made, every moment I thought was special, was nothing more than a rehearsed act. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was the kind of humiliation that made my skin crawl. I wasn't his only one. I was just one of many. A convenient distraction. I broke after that. It was like something inside me just stopped working. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I stopped writing, stopped caring about anything at all. Every time I looked in the mirror, I hated the person staring back. I had destroyed my family, hurt the person who loved me the most, my mom. All for a man who didn't love me, didn't care about me the way I thought he did. I felt disgusting, used, like nothing about me mattered. The pain wasn't just emotional. It was physical, gnawing at my chest, twisting my stomach into knots. I wanted to disappear, to erase every memory of him, But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the truth. I had given everything to someone who wasn't worth it, and now I had nothing left. The road to healing wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. At first, it felt impossible to even take the smallest steps forward. But eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had happened. I started going to therapy, talking about everything, about Thomas, about my mom, about the shame and regret, helped me begin to untangle the mess inside my head. Writing, which I had abandoned in the darkest moments, became my lifeline. I poured every ounce of my pain, anger, and confusion onto the page, and somehow, it started to feel a little lighter. Slowly, I began to understand that what happened wasn't entirely my fault. Thomas had taken advantage of my youth, my vulnerability, my need to feel loved. He had manipulated me into believing we were something we could never truly be. But healing wasn't just about blaming him. It was about forgiving myself. That was the hardest part. Every time I thought about what I'd done to my mom, the woman who had sacrificed so much for me, the guilt was suffocating. One day, I sat down and wrote her a letter. I apologized for everything, for the lies, for the betrayal, for the pain I'd caused. I told her how much I loved her, how much I regretted losing her trust. She didn't respond right away, but eventually, we began talking again. It's not perfect, and it might never be what it once was, but we're working on it. And that gives me hope. Through therapy, I started to understand what healthy love should look like. Love isn't supposed to hurt. It isn't supposed to leave you feeling ashamed or broken. It should lift you up, make you feel whole, not tear you apart piece by piece. Now, I've learned to set boundaries, to recognize red flags, to value myself in ways I never did before. I'm still learning, still healing, but I know this. I deserve better. We all do. What happened with Thomas will always be a part of my story, but it doesn't define me. I define me. It's been years since it all happened, but the scars remain. I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because I know someone out there might be feeling trapped, confused, or ashamed, just like I was. And I need you to hear this. You're not alone. You deserve love that builds you up, love that's honest, kind, and free from guilt or shame. Never settle for less, no matter how lonely or vulnerable you feel. You're worth so much more than that. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Let's start a conversation about what real, healthy love looks like. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Together, we can spread awareness and encourage healthier, happier relationships.